So Laura is a trainer and an author. She also blogs, and you can find her on Twitter. Hi, Laura. Welcome. Thank you for
Hi.
joining us.
Hi, everybody.
Hello. So you can find her online, both on our blogs and on Twitter. You have her Twitter handle there on the last line. And she's talking today with us about how pronunciation boosts proficiency in so many other language areas. So over to you, Laura, and thank you for being here with us.
Thanks, Federica, and thank you very much, everybody, for coming. It's quite unusual times in the world now, so thank you for coming if you're here for professional development or if you just want some company because you're not allowed to leave your house. I'm really glad to see you here. I'm going to share my screen now so you can see my slides. And if it works, you should now be able to see the contents of this webinar. Please type yes in the chat box if you can see the contents. Great, thank you. Okay, so it looks like it's working, and so let's begin. As you can see, we're going to cover 4 main areas. We'll start with the kind of practical bit, the why teach pronunciation at all. Then we will look at some of the common challenges and questions that people have. And of course, we'll spend some time looking at the practical side of things, what we can do in the classroom. We'll have some time at the end for questions and answers. I can hear a few of you saying that you can't hear me. If you can hear me, please type yes in the chat box now. Okay, a lot of you can. So if you have no sound, then somebody from Macmillan will talk to you separately. And meanwhile, let's continue with the webinar, the rest of us. There will be a recording available afterwards. So if anything goes too fast for you, or if you just want to watch again, you'll have that option. And these slides will also be sent to you at the email address that you used to register for the webinar. So you'll have notes at the end, you'll have a recording. So now just participate, and I hope you enjoy. So before we begin, oh, and I forgot to mention, this image represents reflection. There will be a couple of moments during the webinar where I ask you to reflect on what we've discussed, to think about your context, your experience, your students, and so on. So if you see this picture, it means it's time to reflect. Now, in a webinar of this size, there are 500 people I can see. We all have quite a range of experience and comfort, let's say, with teaching pronunciation. So we're going to start with a quick survey. I'm going to open a survey on the screen, and you'll be able to click your answer in the survey. Please don't type your answers in the chat box. Only do that if the survey is broken. But when you see the survey appear, you should be able to click your answers. So we'll use this briefly now just as a way to get to know each other a little bit before we begin. So here comes the survey. And you should see it on your screen now. So there are 2 questions. Please click your answer in the survey. Okay, thank you. I can see about 250, 300 people have voted now. Remember to click the second question as well. Excellent. Over 300 people have voted now. Great. Remember, there are 2 questions. Okay, just 20 seconds to finish voting. Okay, I'm about to close the survey. Cast your vote now if you haven't already. All right, and let me show you the results. You should be able to see that about half of you are fairly confident, but you'd like to learn more. And some of you are not confident at all, and some of you are very confident. So this is quite common. Most people cluster around the middle. They know something, they're comfortable, but we can always learn more. And in terms of training and teaching pronunciation, this is also very common. A lot of us have had a little bit over a long time. Quite a few people have had nothing at all. People who have had lots, I expect that's either because you work in a place with excellent professional development, or you yourself are very interested in pronunciation and you look for opportunities to train. For most teachers around the world, they have limited experience and limited training. So hopefully in the next 53 minutes, there will be something useful for all of you. Now let's go back to the slides. You should be able to see my screen again now, and you should be able to see a screen which says 1.0, the academic part. Why teach pronunciation at all? And I can see lots of yeses in the chat box. Excellent, thank you for confirming. So let's continue. So why teach pronunciation? Or why teach pron? If you're not already a pronunciation geek, then I'll tell you now that we often abbreviate it to pron. So now you're in the club. Reason number one, very good reason, is that it works. There's quite a lot of research now that shows that by practicing pronunciation and developing awareness of pronunciation in a controlled context in the classroom, that does transfer to spontaneous speaking outside class. So it's time well spent. We're maybe not going to see immediate change, like with all learning, but over time, by working on pronunciation in class, learners develop their pronunciation and speaking more freely. So it's definitely worth doing. Reason number two is probably the one we all think of. It's the most obvious, that we know that working on pronunciation improves speaking and listening. That feels natural, that feels obvious, because of course, speaking and listening are all about sound. What I find particularly interesting is that actually improved phonological awareness impacts all 4 skills plus grammar and vocabulary. So there's some research, for example, that shows that learners who have a better sensitivity to pronunciation and the mapping between a written form and a spoken form, they actually become faster, more confident readers as well. And likewise, when they're writing, they're less likely to make crazy guesses at how to spell a word because they have a better awareness of how the written form matches the spoken form, which they already have in their mind. Similarly, with grammar and with vocabulary, I know I've had a lot of experience with students at quite advanced levels who are not using certain words or structures, which I know they understand, I know we've studied. And when I've investigated a little bit more, I've found that they're not confident with how to say these things. So even though they might use them in their writing or they might understand when they hear them, they're not using them because they don't know how to say them and they don't want to make a mistake. There's a lack of confidence, but not a lack of knowledge. So by working on pronunciation in class, you can also make your other work that you do on vocabulary and grammar more likely to benefit, more likely to be used. And similarly, when learners are listening, they're more likely to recognize what they hear. I know a lot of learners who are much more confident with the written form. They know all the rules, they have great vocabulary, but when they leave the classroom and they hear English spoken in the world, they don't understand because they've only really studied the written forms in detail. They haven't had enough exposure to how things sound. So actually developing pronunciation awareness can benefit all 4 skills and other language. It's not just about pronunciation. Unfortunately, teachers around the world generally don't have enough confidence or enough training in teaching pronunciation. There was a very interesting study a few years ago which looked into the pronunciation teaching habits and attitudes of 600 teachers around the world and found that there's not enough training and consequently not a lot of confidence in teaching pronunciation. So hopefully with events like this, we'll improve those numbers a little bit, and maybe if this researcher repeats her study in a few years, things will look a little bit more positive. So basically, we know that pronunciation teaching is necessary, we know that it works, and we know that teachers don't always feel comfortable with it. So I'm very glad that you're all here with me today. So before we look at the practical side, before we do some activities together, let's look at some of the common challenges. So what are some of the things that I've heard very often from teachers, that I've read in academic papers? What are the things that a lot of us are struggling with? Well, first of all, as we've seen, lack of training and confidence. Maybe we're very willing, we're very interested, but we don't really know where to begin. More practically, lack of time. I think I don't know any teacher who doesn't need or want more time for all the things that they have to cover in their syllabus. I hope that because of lack of time, we're not avoiding pronunciation, because as we've just seen, working on pronunciation improves everything, actually. But of course, we all feel like we don't have enough time. I've put lack of time in quotes because, as I'm about to show you, we can actually do quite a lot with what is already on the page of the course book without lots of extra planning time. One question that I'm asked quite often is, well, should I do a whole lesson on pron? I mean, how can I fill 60 minutes, 90 minutes just with pronunciation? My answer to that would be, well, yes, you can if you want to. I mean, the same way that sometimes we fill a whole lesson with grammar or with reading skills, but it's not necessary. And if I had to choose, I would much rather people integrated a little bit and often, because like with all things related to learning, it only happens over time. It needs to be little and often. If you find that there's one thing in particular that it's really useful to focus on for a longer period, great. That's part of your judgment to exercise as a teacher. But I think best to integrate a little bit throughout the course. And then another common question, well, okay, how exactly can I integrate it? So fine, I get it, it's important, I want to do it every day, but where do I begin? Well, have no fear, I'm about to show you. I think we also, though, need to acknowledge at the moment, on this particular day in time, that there is another challenge that many of us are currently facing. It would be remiss not to mention the current state of the world, the fact that many of us are in a position where we're having to move our teaching and our learning online. And that creates a whole lot of challenges and difficulties that are not even related to pedagogy. So we have the risk of our family in the same house. You know, it's one thing to say work from home, but that's not easy when you have other people in the house who rely on you or who need your attention. Similarly, you know, you have pets who are trying to sit on your laptop and your attention is constantly being interrupted. So being realistic, we are at the very moment in kind of a complicated situation. Excuse me. Also, then this increases pressure on us from a professional perspective and a personal perspective. Hopefully we can laugh about it a little bit and relieve some of the pressure. These are some of the things I've seen on social media this week, people reacting to the stress of working from home and teaching from home. I'll give you a moment to read that. So again, the realities of working from home and particularly teaching from home, we can't avoid those realities at the moment. We're going to have to work with them and just do the best that we can. And the reason that I mention all this is because anxiety and uncertainty are often a part of teaching. You know, we really care about what we do and we really want to do a good job. And at the moment, we're being pushed even further outside of our comfort zones. So what can we do about this? I think, as I said, I'm very glad that so many of you have come to this webinar with everything that's happening. And I don't know if you're here for professional development or just for some company because you're trapped indoors. But as I say, we're going to try to do both. And what I've tried to do in this webinar is adapt things slightly so that for every activity, we'll talk about the classroom version, the kind of standard way that I do these, but also an online version so that you don't feel that you've got lots of ideas and then you go away and you can't use them yet because you're teaching online at the moment. So we'll try to do both. So that brings us to the practical part. I hope you're ready to begin. Let's start with our first activity. I'm going to show you a few top tips. I'm starting with this because I think particularly in the current context with a lot of us moving online, it's really important before we do anything practical that we remember why we're doing it. You know, what is the reason that we're teaching this at all? And that will help us make decisions about the technology we use, the activities we use, when technical problems force us to give up, you know, what are we losing? Why were we actually doing these activities in the first place? So a few top tips. Tip number one, as with every area of language learning, do a needs analysis first. We have limited time, we have limited resources, we need to focus our attention on the most important areas. And the first activity I'm going to show you is a needs analysis. So we'll look at how you can do that and how you can integrate that with your course book if you are using a book-based syllabus. Secondly, as I already mentioned, do little and often, and don't skip the prawn sections. I read something really interesting in a paper about a year or two ago, where researchers had looked at a variety of materials and found that often the pronunciation section is designed in a way that looks less important than something like grammar or writing. The way that it's on the page kind of makes it look skippable. And so it's understandable if people think, well, I already am not very confident, I don't know what to do with that, and I don't have time, and it doesn't look very important. But please don't skip the pronunciation sections. They're really, really important. And related to this, you know, teach pronunciation. I think a lot of anxiety around teaching pronunciation comes from the misunderstanding that we have to teach a specific accent, that we're trying to take our student whose first language is Italian or Arabic or Korean and mold them into a monolingual native English speaker. That's not realistic or possible. I think when we're teaching pronunciation, we need to, again, be realistic, remember why we're here. We are teaching our students to be effective bilinguals. We're teaching them to be understood as widely as possible and to understand other people. So really, top tip is to focus on teaching pronunciation. Look at particular features of speech and try not to teach identity. It's much harder. It's not really necessary. And yeah, none of us has enough time for that kind of psychiatric intervention in our English lessons. Second to last is to exploit everything on the page and not just the sections which are labeled pronunciation. And that's really what this webinar is about. Some of us are fortunate enough that we are using a coursebook-led syllabus. We're quite restricted in that, but there is pronunciation content in the course. For some of us, we're not so fortunate, and we need to find creative ways to use what's on the page for the purpose of teaching pronunciation. And for some of us, we want to do both and do it all, and we love pronunciation, and we're all a big family of pronunciation geeks. So whichever of those groups you fall into, I'm going to show you how you can use what's on the page, even if it doesn't say pronunciation, to teach pronunciation. The last tip I will give you, and this is really just for those of you who said in the survey, I'm already very confident. Try some new things. Don't be afraid to try new techniques, to experiment, try new technology. I would say if you are already lacking confidence, lacking training, and particularly if now you find yourself teaching in an unfamiliar environment, prioritize. Don't worry about using every thing. For now, just try maybe one of the new things that we do in this webinar and be fair to yourself. Your students, I think, will always value covering pronunciation, however you do it, because it's generally undertaught and they really appreciate it. So let's do my top 3 activities. Are you ready for the first one? I hope so. The first one is a needs analysis, and we're going to use a dictation for needs analysis, but not the traditional type of dictation, not just the teacher speaking or a recording. We're going to use the students themselves, and we're going to use what is on the page of the book. So let's say that you have an activity which, like any kind of standard, let's say grammar practice, has several short sentences. Maybe they're sentences which demonstrate a language point, or the students have filled in the gaps and now the activity is done. But it's not necessarily done. You can use it later for something else. You can take those sentences and give one per student, make sure that they cannot see each other's, of course, because it's a dictation. You want them to only be relying on what they hear, not on what they read. Very importantly, you give them some time to prepare. They should know that this is a dictation. It's not a test. It's not going to affect their grade. You are using it as a diagnostic tool. So be clear with them about that. Tell them you have a couple minutes to prepare your sentence. You're going to say it as clearly as you can and as naturally as you can, but I'll give you a minute to think about it. So you're not reading something that you've never seen before. The idea is that I want to know how clear your pronunciation is when you're doing your best job. So you give them a moment to prepare, and then each student reads their sentence twice. Twice is enough. Once is usually not enough, simply because we often just can't write that fast, or maybe our working memory is struggling to follow while we're writing. Too many times, and you don't really know how clear their pronunciation was. Maybe the listener just had enough repetitions that finally they got it. So normal, natural speed, like I'm speaking now. And if I said to you, I'm going to tell you a sentence now, write it down. I'm going to show you a video of this in a moment if you really want to see how it works. When you're done, you collect all the students' papers and you analyze them. And this is the most labor-intensive part of this activity. The first part doesn't take that much time. It takes as long as it takes you to type up the sentences and cut them out, so you can give one each to the students, and as long as it takes for each student to prepare themselves and read their sentence twice. So maybe in total, half an hour, mostly in class time. The analysis takes longer because, of course, you have to read and think and look at your notes and cross-reference and compare and type up their feedback. And honestly, yes, that takes time. However, it's really, really valuable time spent. You get so much insight through this activity into what your students are hearing, what they're saying, which is problematic and also not problematic. I've had this experience doing this activity several times where I would have expected something to be unclear to the other students. And then when I collect their papers, I see that everybody understood it fine. So again, that really helps me prioritize in the rest of my syllabus what to spend time on. And it teaches me something. I can see where my assumptions are right or wrong. Let me show you a real example from my class a couple years ago. I had the students' permission to share this. So this is a sentence that one of my students prepared. You can see, I hope you can see my mouse here. You can see that she put a little mark between house and was, where she thought it would be necessary or helpful to pause slightly. You can see that she's also marked with stress bubbles how many syllables are in these words and where the stress should be. She's actually made a mistake here, so that already tells me something. Even if she never said the sentence, I can see that she thinks complete has 3 syllables and is stressed on the first, when in reality it has 2 syllables and is stressed on the second. But that already tells me something. That tells me that in her best effort, she needs help with this. And this student's first language was Japanese, and the syllable structure in Japanese is quite different from English. 2 consonants and ended up with 2 syllables also reflects something. Now you're analyzing their written work, just to respond to this question in the chat box, as well as the sound, because you're in the classroom with them when they do it. But you can see things in writing that you don't necessarily hear. So for example, with this student, she pronounced complete quite clearly, but I can see that she kind of got lucky because actually she doesn't understand the pronunciation of that word. There's a gap in her knowledge. While that student is then reading their sentence after they've prepared, the other students have a table like this. So they have a space for every student and for what they said. So let's imagine student number 1 is called Laura. While Laura is reading her sentence, the other students have written her name here. And while she's reading her sentence, they write it here. And then it's the next student's turn. And again, I'll show you a completed example now. So this is what one of the students, the same student who wrote this sentence that I just showed you, this is what she wrote when the other students were reading their sentences. So I can see that she's made a mistake here. The actual sentence that the other student had read said into the car. Now, I don't have enough evidence yet to know if that is a problem with her grammatical knowledge, that she was writing quickly and made a grammar mistake, or if she didn't hear the unstressed syllable. And this is where looking at all their sentences really helps me, because if a lot of students made that mistake, then I'm guessing the person reading the sentence had a very quiet, unstressed syllable in the word into that they all missed. So I'm getting insights at different levels. I can also see that this student has difficulty with spelling. Like she understood the word, this was the word true, but she's written it with the letters a little bit mixed. And this is the word lovely, and she's missed an L. This, where she's written get up, was actually that top. So here I can guess it might not be a pronunciation issue, it's partly vocabulary, but despite the clarity of the student who was reading this sentence, she still didn't get it. So there's probably a couple things happening there. It's partly that she doesn't know the vocabulary, and it's partly that the student who read the sentence didn't articulate clearly enough for her to make a better guess. So there's a lot of things happening on a lot of levels, and that's why I say the analysis is quite intense, but really interesting. Now, at this point, you probably want to see what it looks like. I recorded this a few years ago with this class, again, with their permission to share. The whole video is available online, and it's about 15 or 16 minutes. So I'm not going to show you all of it, but I am going to show you a clip now. So I'm going to move to the video player. You should see that appear on your screen now. Please type yes if you can see the video player now. Okay, great, thank you. And I'm going to play you just a very short clip so that you can see one student reading her sentence and the kind of speed and so on. Please make sure that your volume is up loud enough so that you can hear this in detail. And I will count to 5 and then press play so you're ready. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So, Patsko, can you go first? Yes. Other students, can you find time to tell? Yeah. You can read your sentence 2 times, not too fast. Okay. And the other students, just listen.
I just wanted to say, I'm really sorry. I missed the match. I just wanted to say, I'm really sorry. I missed the match.
Thank you.
We have to ask, we have to have.
Okay, I've paused the video there as it continues like that, every student, their line. I will go back to the screen sharing now, so you should be able to see my slides again. And again, you'll have the slides at the end of the webinar, which have a link. So if for any reason you weren't able to see it then, you'll be able to watch it later in your own time. The reason I let the clip continue playing a little bit after this student finished her sentence is so that you can see the gap that I leave after she finishes for everyone to finish writing. This is an element of self-control that maybe I didn't have the first time I did it, so now I always recommend that people remember somebody is writing something they just heard, they're keeping it in working memory, and they're really focused. So let them finish that. Give them 5 to 10 seconds before you then move to the next person. The silence of the teacher is quite important in this activity. I can see a lot of you typing questions in the chat box. We're going to do questions and answers at the end, so maybe make a note, and if you have time at the end, I can talk about each activity. And we'll also do a little bit of reflection after this, so perhaps somebody else can answer your question. So what you can see here is these are the 4 transcriptions of the 4 other students for the student who we just watched. So her sentence was, I just wanted to say, I'm really sorry I missed the match. And again, I can see a couple of things here. I can see that of all 4 students, 2 of them got it exactly right. So generally she was quite clear. And the 2 who didn't, one of them has spelling difficulty. This is the same student that we saw earlier with other spelling difficulties. This may not feel like pronunciation, but at least in English and in a lot of languages, the written form is supposed to give you some indication of sound. So the fact that she makes so many spelling mistakes shows me that she needs to develop her awareness of the typical spelling patterns of some sounds. Here, she's not wrong in her guess that CH makes a ch sound, but she's missing the T because TCH also makes a ch sound. So she has some improvement to make in her spelling sound associations. This student didn't hear the final t on missed. And this is something that comes up quite often. I see not just in a dictation like this, but where students know perfectly well if I give them a grammar exercise to put ed on the end of everything. But in their speech, they don't use it, and in their listening, they don't hear it. So there's something happening there, which I suspect is a lack of pronunciation awareness. When we teach the grammar, we don't look at how it sounds. We don't drill the pronunciation. So further down the road, even when the students are quite proficient, and this was a strong intermediate class, students are still making mistakes like this. These are the notes that I took. You could see me in that video scribbling away. So I have all the sentences that they're reading, and I'm able to annotate things that I heard. So I can hear, for example, in this student sentence, that when she paused, her intonation went up slightly, that she had a slightly long vowel when she said wanted. It was more like wanted. And she didn't say the, she said z. But again, I draw your attention to the fact that neither of those things that I wrote as potentially problematic was really problematic. All of the other students heard that fine. All of the other students heard the. And this is so, so important for me and for them, because we spend a lot of time and energy correcting certain sounds, which maybe are not causing so much difficulty, so many problems. And we need to prioritize. We don't have enough time to do justice to everything. So this is one way that we can start to identify priorities. Similarly, if we notice that some things are only a problem for a certain learner, we can give them individual feedback and they can develop things on their own for homework. If this student, for example, this first student, was one of those students who really draws a lot of attention from the teacher, then I might mistakenly think the whole class needs to improve their spelling, when actually most of them were okay, but she needed a lot of help. So again, it helps you identify priorities, not just for the individuals, but for the whole class and how to spend your time. So this is the classroom version. I promised I would tell you an online version. One way that you can adapt this, if you're doing it virtually, is partly like we are doing now. So we can use examples of people speaking in video or so on. Ask the student. Alternatively, you can still distribute the sentences to the students, but you send it to them privately via a chat or via an email or whatever way you communicate with your students. You could also ask the students then to read their sentences and record themselves using their mobile device, and then they can share the file. There's an element of trust here that your students will only listen twice. But to be honest, I think generally we can trust them. I find it's very rare that you have a student who is so excited about this activity that they want to listen to every other student 10 times, especially if they have 20 or 30 people in their class. Twice is probably enough. And if you need to limit it somehow because you have a large class, you could ask them only to listen to some of the other students, for example. The only problem there is that you might find that you have to be quite strict about who listens to who so that you don't miss anyone, and that can be a logistical nightmare. So again, you have to trust your students. There's an element of trust here. And when they submit their transcriptions, they can do that electronically too. And to help you, I would suggest you use a collaborative tool like Google Docs. So they can type their transcriptions, and then you can type their feedback in the same doc. You can also search the document later in a way that you can't do with written notes. So if you remember one day that, oh, somebody had trouble spelling the word match, but who was it? You can search the document for the misspelled version and it will take you to that one. I'll show you how it looks. Here's an example I made before. So here's a different sentence. Let's imagine Laura is transcribing Pablo's sentence and she wrote this. But Pablo actually said the air, and he said aren't. So I've said, there's a missing word here. I've said, listen again here. And again, you'll notice that in my feedback here, because it's digital, I'm being a little bit less instructive. I'm hoping that they'll go back and listen again. And they'll sort of teach themselves a little bit, because one of the biggest challenges of online teaching is the learner's autonomy and being self-disciplined and having enough information to take the next step and not just being given everything and scrolling past it. So this is just one way that you can do it digitally. Now, I've been talking at you for a really, really long time, and I think it's time that we have our first reflection moment. So I'm going to give you a minute to share your thoughts in the chat box about how this might work in your context or with your students, your experience, and any ideas that you have for adapting it. If you have questions for me, I'll ask you to save them until the end. You can type them now, but we'll answer all the questions at the end of the webinar. One thing I will say, though, is I've just seen a couple of people say, oh, it sounds boring or it's not fun. I am consistently amazed by how much the students enjoy this. They are so focused, they're so interested to know whether other students understood them, to listen really carefully. They never get the chance for careful listening. And often we're teaching listening skills like, oh, don't worry if you don't understand everything. In this case, they have to understand everything. And it always surprises me how much they enjoy that. Okay, so carry on with your reflection. How would this adapt in your context? I can see some interesting comments and questions. As a competition, I wouldn't do that the first few times, because I think this is a diagnostic activity and the students know that. And if they thought it was competitive, they'd be very self-conscious. And especially if they have difficulty with pronunciation, I think it would make them a little bit scared. Oh, interesting. They can use WhatsApp. Yes, you can record voice messages on WhatsApp. So if the students already use that medium for learning, fine. Okay, let's move on to the next activity. And I would just say, in terms of activity, I only write a couple sentences for each student about how they spoke and how they understood. Because there's a lot of work involved. So I work out what my priorities are, and then I communicate that to them. So for the student that we've looked at most closely in this demo, I would say to her something like, I can see that you spoke quite clearly. Most of the other students understood your pronunciation. A couple of them had difficulty when you said this word, so be careful with this sound. I can't remember now exactly which word it was, but I know that there was one thing that she struggled with, the L and the R, and some of the other students misheard what she said and wrote something different. For her listening skills, I'd give her similarly a couple of brief sentences, like, you seem to understand your peers very well. Sometimes you don't know the vocabulary, and so you guess, and that's okay, you're still learning. You need to develop your knowledge of common spelling patterns because you made a number of spelling mistakes. Okay. So let's move on to the next activity, and this activity is called Sound Hunt. Now, if you are fortunate enough to have a course book like this that has pronunciation sections in the book, then great. It's really helpful to have this content, but we don't always have this. Sometimes we have activities that look similar, but they're only for grammar or for vocabulary. Now, in the case of the Sound Hunt, this integrates pronunciation with reading. So if you have a coursebook-based syllabus with lots of reading texts, you can do a sound hunt after they've done the reading and the reading comprehension. Because remember that when people have better awareness of sound, they also become better readers. This is quite good for a homework or an extension activity as well, and it works for any level, because remember, you're using what is in their course book, and presumably you're already using a course book that is generally appropriate to their level. So you're not adding anything, you're not making anything, you're not including vocabulary that is too high for them. So what the students do is they mine a text for examples of a particular sound. I choose the sound based on the needs analysis I've done. So I think, okay, they need to have a better awareness of where this sound occurs or how this is spelled. And what they're doing is they're noticing common sound and spelling associations. When they've done the activity, then I ask them to think of more examples. So they're starting with something that's already familiar. They've already read the text. They've done all the comprehension exercises. They've talked about the ideas. That's all done. Now I want them to really look very closely at a micro level at specific representations of sound. So let's do an example together. Here is a text from the Language Hub coursebook. And I wouldn't use the whole text unless you have really, really, really strong and enthusiastic students. I would just use a small section like this. And you don't need to do anything extra. You don't need to type it again. You don't need to make it bigger. You can if you want to, but it's already there in the book, so you can adapt and integrate. I will zoom in for your sake. What I'm going to do is give you the section to read for 30 seconds. Because remember, I said I usually do this pronunciation activity after the students have already read everything and they've seen the text and they've had a chance to familiarize themselves. With you, you're already experienced and proficient English users, so you only get 30 seconds. So I'll give you 30 seconds to read this text, and then we'll do the pronunciation activity. Here you go. And your 30 seconds is up. Now remember, I'm simulating because this is a demo. With students, they would have much more time. They would have already read this. Maybe they did it in a lesson the previous day. So now they've looked at it on a macro level and they've looked at the vocabulary and the meaning and so on. Now they can look at a micro level at sound. So I'll show you the text again. With students, I would probably just give them one sound to look for. But you're experts, and I'm going to push you. I'm going to give you two sounds to look for. I want you to look for these two, s and z. Okay? Sound as in st, and the second sound as in zoo. I'm going to give you 1 minute, and let's imagine that you as a class need a little bit of extra support. Maybe some of the students are quite weak or lack confidence. So I won't just give you the text and tell you to find sounds. I'll tell you how many that there are. And that gives you a little bit of extra support. So I'll tell you now that in this text, there are 9 examples of the S sound, and there are 10 examples of the Z sound. And I'll give you 1 minute to find them. Here you go. Your minute begins now. Oh, and wait. Please do not type your answers in the chat box. Not yet. Again, I want to demonstrate something I would do with students here. We don't want the strongest students to lead the activity and not give the others a chance. So I'll show you the text. I want you to find the sounds, but for now, just try to remember or make a written note. Don't type them in the chat box yet. I will tell you when. Okay, you have 1 minute. Thirty seconds. And your minute is up. So now let's start only with the first sound, with S. Can you type in the chat box the words that you found? Interesting, great, okay. And now we'll move to the second sound. Please type the words that you found with Z. Oh, great, brilliant. Now, I will say that ordinarily when you're teaching, I hope you're not teaching a class of 585 students, so the chat box won't move quite so fast as it's moving now. But I find that structuring feedback in this way helps keep all of the students working at a similar pace. And again, remember, if you set this task for homework, then they can take as long as they need and send you their answers independently. Let's check the answers now. Here are all the S sounds. There are 9. And all the Z sounds. There are 10. And remember that this is quite an adaptable activity, so for weaker learners, you can tell them how many of each sound they're looking for before they try, or you can tell them to find fewer than there really are. So I could say, for example, find 5 of each, and then that gives them more of a chance of getting some, even if they don't get all. For stronger learners, you don't tell them anything besides the sound at the beginning. You just say, find this sound. Or you can let them read a longer text, or you can ask them to make a version of the activity, which you then share with the peers in another lesson. So they're kind of creating their own adaptations and integrating with the course book. And by virtue of creating the activity, they are also learning and checking their knowledge. Now, I said as an extension to think of some more examples. I'll give you 30 seconds really quickly if you want to type another example of a word with S or another example of a word with Z in the chat box. Please just make it clear which sound you're giving an example for. So you might write S, sunny. See, soon, sleep, good. Oh, wisdom, very nice, okay. Examples, as to Z. Zip, good, reads, exactly. Really nice way of doing the activity, and I didn't have to create any more material. Everything was in my course book, something the students had already done, and it just makes the activity a little more alive. It brings things off the page. An online version, well, obviously we just did one. There are other things that you can do to take this online. So you could ask the students to do it on paper in their regular books, which they're already using, and then just send you a photo of what they circled, for example. A lot of teleconferencing software also allows students to draw on the screen. So I prepared earlier and put circles around the answers, but you could also do that live, either you controlling the pen or them controlling the pen. Or if they do this on their screen at home as homework, they can annotate it and then take a screenshot, take a picture of the screen to share with you. So there's different ways that you can share it digitally. And of course, in the digital environment, if they're not sure, or you want them to check their own answers or make their own activities, they can also check an online dictionary. The benefit of the online dictionary as opposed to the print dictionary is not only will it have the information, but it will also have audio that they can listen to. So again, you're reinforcing the relationship between the spelling and the sound. Very quick reflection. 2 questions. Did you enjoy that? And do you think your students would? Very quick reflection. Type your answers in the chat box, please. I did, and yes, they will. Great. Yes, yes, yes. I'm open to hearing no's as well. It would be good to know, if not, why not? You know, what do you think is the challenge? But maybe we can come to that in the questions and answers. Okay, let's do our last activity. The last activity for integrating pronunciation with your book is called Find Something in Common. This activity is very similar to the sound hunt in that it helps students notice what is right in front of them, something that is already there, and it helps them get more from that. Because I think so much of what we could be learning is right there in front of us a lot of the time, but we haven't had anybody to direct our attention. So this works in a similar way to sound hunt. It could be used maybe to start the next lesson. Say after you've done a certain activity, and then the next day you say, oh, remember this? We're going to look at it again, but we're going to look at it in a different way. And what the students do is they have to look for 2 or more words or phrases that contain the same feature, the same sound or the same stress pattern. So it's a little bit like sound hunt, except that you're really focusing on what things have in common. And this is one way that I've found, especially with sounds, rather than stress, to help students build up a better concept of a sound because they have to find things which rhyme. And I've had students at very high levels, for example, realize suddenly after 15 years of English that words like where, W-H-E-R-E, and were, W-E-R-E, don't have the same vowel sound. But they've never really thought about it this way. So this activity gets them to recognize what things have in common. And after you've done it, you can write the words on pieces of paper and then use them again in future for revision or for testing peers. So maybe after you've done this activity many times, they have 50 pieces of paper and you ask them to put them in groups according to words that have the same sound or the same first sound or the same stress pattern or something like that. Let's do a demo so you know what I mean. Here's an example of a collocations exercise from a course book. So let's imagine the students did this activity yesterday. They did it for vocabulary. So they've gone and they've chosen A, B, or C for each one. Now I'm going to ask them to find some pronunciation that is hidden in plain sight. I'm going to ask them to find all the examples of this stress pattern. Da, 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 like banana. So 3 syllables, and the second one is stressed. This time, I'll ask you to type your answers in the chat box as you go. And I'll give you about 60 seconds. I would encourage you, like students, to say the words out loud. Hear yourself say them and count the syllables on your hands. And you're not just choosing A, B, or C, you're choosing from all of the text in the activity, every word on the page. Okay, we've got some right answers. Let's check the answers together. So words that have exactly the same stress pattern, da, 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 are these. So attention, investors, and expenses. But notice that there are also some distractors hidden on the page. So there are some words that have 3 syllables, but a different stress pattern, like these ones. So all of these words, company, customers, recently, have 3 syllables, but the stress is on the first, not the second. And similarly, this one has 2 syllables, but a lot of students may feel that it has 3. Now, this is on the page in the course book, but ordinarily we would do the vocabulary activity and then move on. In this way, you get the students to look more closely at what is already there in front of them. And all of this information about pronunciation is available in a dictionary. So if at any point you're not sure or they're not sure, you can check. You can kind of check your own answer key. And in this case, I'm limiting the number of correct answers. I'm showing you everything. This has all 3 words that have the same stress pattern. But if you're not sure or you're worried you might miss something, you can always limit. So find as many as you can and then subtract 2 or 1 so that you know that if the students find this many, then at least that many exist. There may be more, but you only ask them to find a couple. Now, how can you take this activity online? Again, if you don't trust your students not to look at other people's answers in the chat box, you can ask them not to type anything until the time is up, like we did earlier. Or if you're able to, you can disable the chat box temporarily, or you set this task for homework, so it's not done in a group anyway. As an online version, instead of slips of paper for peer testing, you can use a collaborative spreadsheet, something like Google Sheets, which is like Excel. So you could have a column for groups of things with the same feature. Or you can make flashcards with online tools as well. And our final reflection is not just a reflection, but actually time for our questions and answers, because we're at the end of the webinar now and we have just a few minutes left for questions and answers, which Federica from Macmillan is going to help me organize the questions and address a few. So all that's left is for me to say thank you very much for attending, especially under the circumstances, and especially if you are one of the people at the moment working from home with children and cats climbing all over you and so on. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you
so our
so
final
much.
reflection and questions and answers. Federica, would you like to help me choose some questions?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for such a great session, Laura, and thank you everyone
My pleasure.
for attending. It was absolutely great. So there was a question. If you have questions, do type them into the chat box, but there was one that kept popping up during the session, and it was at what level, both age-wise and proficiency-wise, would you recommend that teachers start focusing on pronunciation with their students and, teaching them how to use these tools that we've been talking about?
Very good question. Start immediately. Pronunciation is always there. At the moment that you're learning English the first day and you only know 3 words, I guarantee you want to say them. And the pronunciation is already there. We can't avoid it. It's not so easy to grade or minimize the way you do with other things like vocabulary and grammar. As soon as you open your mouth, there's sound. In terms of proficiency levels, then, I'd say start immediately. In terms of age as well, as soon as people open their mouths, pronunciation is there. For these activities in particular, one of the reasons I like them is because they all work with what is already in the book, and assuming that the book is appropriate for the age and the proficiency level of your students, then so are these activities, because you're already using what's there. So really, anything, any age, any proficiency level, you can always do something with pronunciation.
That's great. Thank you. There's a question that I managed
Next
to
question?
pin. Yeah, there's one pin at the top of the chat box. I don't know if you can see that.
Yes, in the needs dictation, the students use the sentences from the current unit. I advise that they don't make them themselves. The reason being that pronunciation does not operate in isolation. It always interacts with the structures and the words that we're using. And if there's any chance that your students are going to make sentences that the other students won't understand because of the grammar or the vocabulary, then it's going to ruin your activity. So use sentences that you know are accurate, clear, and that the students have already seen in the course book at some point in the past.
Yeah, that's great. There's another one. Yeah.
Can we divide our students according to the level of their pronunciation? I'm not sure I know what that means. If I understand correctly, you mean organizing the groups into students who are better or students who are worse, I think. I don't think it's that simple, to be honest. It's pronunciation can be quite misleading. Sometimes we feel like if we understand someone well, then they have good pronunciation. And if another person doesn't understand them, then they have bad pronunciation. But one of the most common myths about pronunciation is that it's all about the speaker. It's not. The listener has a huge role to play. And often it's the listener's expectations that determine how easy it is to understand somebody. So I don't think it's very easy to divide people according to pronunciation level.
That's great. And there was also another question that was that kept popping up, and it was, if you have a big classroom, I think I read up to 45 people, how can you actually divide them, or do you even do that? Divide them into those small groups to practice those activities, especially the needs pronunciation that you talked about.
Yeah, the needs analysis is a bit of a different one. For the other activities, you can do that with as many students as you need, because really all you need to do, especially if you're online, is provide an answer key for them to check later. For the needs analysis, I treat it a little bit like I would treat tutorials. So any kind of lesson time where you really need to address each student individually or in small groups, usually I would manage that in a special lesson where, while some of the students are doing one thing, I'm with the other students doing another thing. This isn't something that you can do all the time because it's too much work, but at the beginning of the course, it's hugely valuable. And then maybe at a halfway point. So if you have a really big group, I suggest you have to split them up, divide them into, say, 10 students at a time. It would just be easier for you.
Thank you, Laura. That's great. And I think we have time for one more question because we've gone over the hour. So,
okay.
How much useful can it be to mix with other language skills?
Exceptionally useful. That's really the main motivation for giving a webinar like this, is that we often think that pronunciation is a separate area, but in reality, pronunciation needs to be integrated with everything else because it is always there. It's always present, even when we think it's not, like reading and writing. We know that people who have a better awareness of sound are faster readers, at least in English, or at least in systems where in language systems where the spelling and the sound have a relationship. So very important to mix with other areas.
Being a learner of English as a foreign language myself, I couldn't agree more, honestly. And, I've seen the difference going from where my pronunciation started to where it's got now. And we know it's not perfect, but, I am a faster reader now than I was. So
Great. Congratulations.
Thank you. Not questions in the chat box, of course, but for all the rest. So thank you so much, Laura. That was a great session. Thank you on behalf of everyone here at Macmillan. And I'd like to...
thank you all for attending.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thanks to Mike Crowley for organizing such a great series of webinars.